For 40 years, she poured every ounce of her love, her strength, and her savings into a family she believed would cherish her forever. But on one crisp holiday morning, everything changed. A single envelope slid across the table, not with gratitude, but with orders. Clean the house before we're back. No invitation, no thank you, just a list of chores in the home she'd built with her own hands. That night, while the rest of them dreamed of tropical beaches, she found something they never expected, a truth hidden in plain sight, and with it, the quiet kind of power that doesn't scream or beg, but walks away, leaving silence loud enough to break hearts. This is not a story of revenge. It's a story of a woman who learned she didn't need their approval to be whole, and once she stood up, nothing could put her back down. Evelyn Hart had always believed Thanksgiving was sacred, not because of the turkey or the pies, but because it was the one day when her family gathered under the same roof, the roof she had fought so hard to keep over their heads. At 68, she moved slower than she used to, but her hands still knew the rhythm of kneading dough, basting a turkey, and setting a table with the same china her mother had once cherished. Every corner of her home whispered a memory: Daniel's first steps in the hallway, late-night talks with her late husband by the fireplace, the laughter of birthdays long gone. This year felt no different, at least in the beginning. Daniel arrived first with the children, bright-eyed Sophie, 10, and mischievous Ben, 7. They flung their arms around Evelyn's waist as though the months apart had been years. She hugged them tightly, inhaling the warm scent of their hair, memorizing it like a prayer. Moments like these kept her going. Clara came in last, her entrance as rehearsed as a stage performance. Immaculate in a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly pension, Clara's blonde hair was pulled into a sleek bun. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that felt sharp, as if it could cut. "Evelyn, darling," she said, her voice sugar-sweet yet oddly commanding. "Why don't you just focus on the kitchen? I'll handle the dining room today." Evelyn didn't argue. She'd learned years ago that pushing back only soured the air. The kitchen was her sanctuary anyway, the place where she felt most herself. The turkey roasted to golden perfection. The stuffing was seasoned just right, and the sweet potato casserole bubbled invitingly in the oven. She thought, perhaps naively, that tonight would be one of the good nights. The house soon filled with the pleasant chaos of guests arriving. Clara's parents with their polite small talk, Daniel's Uncle Joe with his booming laugh, and the children darting between rooms. Evelyn's heart swelled. Yes, she thought, this was worth every sacrifice. When everyone finally settled at the long oak dining table, a table Evelyn had bought decades ago with her first holiday bonus, Daniel took his place at the head. Clara sat beside him, posture perfect, smile wide. Evelyn slipped into her usual seat near the kitchen door, ready to jump up for extra rolls or a forgotten ladle. "Before we say grace," Clara began, her voice ringing clear with the confidence of someone used to holding an audience, "I have a little surprise for everyone." She reached beneath her chair and pulled out a cream envelope, the color perfectly matching her sweater. Her manicured nails slid the card free with a deliberate elegance. Evelyn's first thought was that perhaps they were expecting another child, but Clara's announcement was nothing of the sort. "We're going to Maui," she declared, holding up a glossy card with palm trees printed across it. 10 whole days of sun and relaxation. We leave tomorrow morning." The table erupted in cheers. The children clapped. Uncle Joe offered his congratulations, and Clara's parents beamed with pride. Evelyn smiled weakly, even as a hollow feeling crept into her chest. She wondered who would care for the house while they were gone. Clara answered that question before Evelyn could ask. With a sly glance in her direction, she pulled out a second card, smaller, but printed in the same elegant script. She slid it across the table toward Evelyn. Evelyn read it once, then again as though her eyes might be lying. house-sitting duties, deep clean all rooms, organize closets, tend plants, completion by December 5th. Thank you for your service. The words cut sharper than any insult. Service. As though she were hired help. As though the years she had spent raising Daniel alone after his father died, working 2 jobs to keep this house, meant nothing. I don't understand, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Clara's smile tightened into something almost predatory. Well, someone has to look after the house while we're gone. You don't mind, do you? You practically live here, and it's not like you have anywhere else to be. The chatter around the table stilled. Uncle Joe looked away. Clara's mother busied herself with her napkin. Even Daniel, her own son, said nothing, just shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sophie's small voice broke the silence. "Grandma, aren't you coming with us?" Clara answered before Evelyn could. "Oh, sweetie, Grandma's too old for vacations like this. She'd rather take care of the house. Wouldn't you, Evelyn?" It was a question disguised as kindness, but Evelyn knew it was a challenge. Her cheeks burned. She forced her lips into something that might pass for a smile. "Of course," she said softly. "I'll take good care of everything." The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Evelyn nodded when expected, laughed when prompted, all the while feeling something inside her splinter. She thought of the countless Thanksgivings she had hosted, the meals she had cooked, the roof she had kept over their heads. And now she was nothing more than the caretaker of her own home. When the plates were cleared and goodbyes exchanged, Evelyn stood alone in her kitchen. The cream-colored card lay on the counter, its elegant lettering mocking her. "Thank you for your service." She read it aloud just to hear how it sounded in the emptiness. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, and though she didn't yet know it, they would become the spark that lit a fire she hadn't felt in years. The night air was crisp when Evelyn stepped out onto the porch to wave goodbye. Daniel was loading the children into the car, Sophie chattering about beaches and seashells, Ben too sleepy to do more than nod. Clara lingered on the front steps, chatting animatedly with one of the guests who had left later than the rest, a tall man in a dark coat Evelyn didn't recognize. At first, she thought nothing of it. Clara was always gracious to guests, always making sure people felt seen. But then she caught it, an exchange of glances that lingered just a fraction too long, the kind that wasn't meant for public view. Clara's smile softened in a way Evelyn had never seen directed at Daniel. The man's hand brushed against hers briefly, deliberately, before he tipped his hat and walked away into the night. A prickle of unease crawled up Evelyn's spine. She stood frozen, unsure if what she'd seen was real or just her imagination. Maybe she was tired. Maybe the insult of the evening had made her sensitive, seeing shadows where there were none. Still, the image of Clara's softened gaze clung to her mind like smoke. Inside, the house felt suddenly too quiet. The clatter and laughter of the evening had been replaced by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Evelyn moved slowly through the dining room, collecting stray glasses, her eyes lingering on the now empty chairs. She tried to summon the warmth she'd felt earlier when Sophie and Ben had run into her arms. For a moment, she let herself believe that maybe Clara hadn't meant to hurt her. Maybe the house-sitting card was an awkward attempt at humor gone wrong. Clara could be sharp-tongued, but she was also under a lot of pressure, keeping up appearances, managing 2 young children. Evelyn had been a young mother once. She remembered the exhaustion, the way it could twist kindness into something brittle. But then the memory of that lingering glance cut through her sympathy like a blade. If there was something Clara was hiding, what did it mean for Daniel? For Sophie and Ben? She carried the empty glasses into the kitchen, setting them gently in the sink. Her hands moved automatically, rinsing, stacking, wiping. She'd done this 1,000 times before, after birthdays and Christmases, after late-night talks and stormy family arguments. But tonight, the rhythm felt different, more like she was erasing the evidence of a gathering she hadn't truly been part of. On the counter, the cream-colored card still lay where she'd left it. The words shimmered faintly in the lamplight. "Thank you for your service." Evelyn picked it up again, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. She thought of the man in the dark coat, the way Clara's eyes had softened, the brush of hands. It wasn't her place to meddle. She told herself that over and over. But hadn't her whole life been about protecting her family? From bills that couldn't be paid, from neighbors' gossip, from the loneliness that crept in after her husband's passing. If there was a danger now, whether to Daniel's marriage or to the stability of her grandchildren's lives, didn't she have a duty to see it? Her mind was a pendulum, swinging between warmth and suspicion. She remembered Sophie's laughter at the dinner table, Ben's head leaning against her shoulder when he got sleepy. That warmth pushed her to forgive, to believe the best. But the echo of Clara's gaze toward that stranger yanked her back down into doubt. She took a deep breath and glanced toward the coat rack by the door. Daniel's jacket still hung there, a few envelopes poking out of the pocket. Evelyn hesitated, feeling the old instinct to look away, to respect boundaries. But tonight had blurred those lines. She reached out and gently slid the envelopes free. Most were harmless, utility bills, junk mail. But one was different. A glossy invitation with the same palm tree design as the Maui trip card. It was addressed not to Daniel, but to Clara and guest. No mention of family. No mention of Daniel. The breath caught in Evelyn's throat. She set the invitation down as though it burned. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. Her heart pounded and she felt the curve of the evening's emotional path, starting with the warmth of greeting her grandchildren, sinking low with Clara's assignment, climbing briefly with the hope that it was all a misunderstanding, then plummeting again with the weight of what she'd just seen and found. She told herself she would sleep on it, that she wouldn't jump to conclusions. But Evelyn knew herself well enough to recognize that tonight had shifted something in her. She'd always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, the steady presence no one noticed until she was gone. Now, as she turned off the lights and headed for bed, the cream-colored card still in her hand, Evelyn felt a cold clarity settling in her chest. Whatever was going on, she was done being invisible. The morning after the Thanksgiving dinner, the house felt hollow, stripped of its usual bustle. Evelyn stood by the front window, sipping her coffee, and watched Daniel's SUV disappear down the street. The children's sleepy faces had pressed to the glass as they waved goodbye, but Clara hadn't looked back. Her last words had been clipped instructions. The baseboards need scrubbing. The guest room closets are a mess. And don't forget to water Daniel's golf clubs. Leather dries out in winter. Now the silence was thick enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Evelyn wandered through the living room, picking up abandoned toys, folding a forgotten scarf. The cream-colored "Thank you for your service" card still sat on the mantel, mocking her in elegant script. She decided to start with the dining room, removing the fine china Clara had insisted on using. China that Evelyn had purchased decades ago and used sparingly, always with care. She boxed each plate and cup, thinking of all the meals they'd shared at this table, before the atmosphere had turned into a performance for Clara's benefit. When she reached Daniel and Clara's bedroom, Evelyn hesitated. She had rarely stepped inside since they'd redecorated, replacing her late husband's sturdy oak furniture with sleek, soulless pieces. But the list Clara had left was clear: deep clean master bedroom. She began with the dresser, dusting around framed photographs. Most were of Daniel and the children, all perfectly posed. Clara appeared in nearly every shot, her smile flawless. Evelyn opened the top drawer to dust inside and froze. A small stack of envelopes lay tucked at the back. Most were addressed to Daniel from the bank, but the return address made her frown. This was not their local branch, but a P.O. box in another state. Curiosity warred with caution, but her name was on the deed to this house. She had every right to know. Evelyn pulled one envelope free and slid the letter out. Her eyes moved quickly over the page, and her breath caught. The statements listed monthly payments labeled as mortgage withdrawals. Payments Daniel had apparently been making for 5 years. But she knew with absolute certainty that the mortgage had been paid off 15 years ago, using the entirety of her husband's life insurance after his sudden death. Her hands trembled as she dug deeper into the pile, statement after statement, all showing large sums deposited into an account under Clara's name. Clara hadn't just been spending recklessly. She had convinced Daniel they still owed on a debt that no longer existed. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, the papers spread around her. The shock was cold and sharp, but underneath it came a strange, steely calm. She remembered the meetings with their lawyer, Harold, after her husband passed, how he had encouraged her to keep the deed in her name to protect the home. She had listened, partly out of grief, partly out of stubbornness. That decision, made so long ago, had just become her shield. She walked to the small office she kept upstairs and opened the old metal filing cabinet in the corner. Inside, in a plastic sleeve, was the original deed. Her name, Evelyn Hart, stood in crisp black ink. No co-owners, no liens, no debts. She ran her fingers over the paper, feeling the weight of it, the history. This house wasn't just a building. It was the sum of decades of sacrifices. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep it after her husband's passing. She'd hosted every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone here. And now, Clara had been treating her like an unwelcome guest in her own home, while quietly siphoning money from Daniel. Setting the deed beside the stack of fraudulent statements, Evelyn's mind began to shift. She had always been cautious, conflict-averse, willing to endure small humiliations for the sake of peace. But this wasn't a slight to ignore. It was betrayal, layered on top of years of disrespect. The clock chimed noon. Evelyn realized she hadn't eaten, but her hunger was replaced by a different kind of appetite, one for clarity, for control. She picked up the phone and dialed Harold's office. Mrs. Chen, his longtime secretary, recognized her voice immediately and promised to have Harold call back as soon as possible. Hanging up, Evelyn looked around the bedroom one last time. The silk comforter, the modern art on the walls, the impersonal perfection, it all belonged to Clara's vision, not hers. But the bones of the house were still Evelyn's. Every beam, every floorboard, every memory embedded in the walls. They were hers by right, by law, and by the years she'd poured into them. She gathered the financial documents into a neat folder and carried them to her own room, setting them beside the deed. As she closed the drawer of her bedside table, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the one who'd been handed a cleaning list at Thanksgiving dinner and quietly accepted it. This Evelyn's eyes were clear, her shoulders straight. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows. Somewhere far away, Daniel and the children were probably laughing on a sunny beach. Clara was likely smiling for photos, posting captions about family bliss. But here, in the quiet of her own home, Evelyn was making plans. And for the first time in years, she wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess. She was preparing for her own beginning. The house was quiet enough for Evelyn to hear the faint tick of the hallway clock, each second a reminder of how empty the rooms felt without the children's voices. She had placed the folder of mortgage statements and the deed on her nightstand, thinking she had uncovered the full truth. But something gnawed at her, a small, persistent itch that there was more hidden in that bedroom. Clara's meticulous nature didn't leave loose ends lying around unless she thought no one would dare to look. Evelyn returned to Daniel and Clara's room, her steps slow but deliberate. She opened the closet, scanning the rows of designer dresses and neatly aligned shoes. Her eyes landed on a large leather tote bag high on the top shelf, slightly out of place among the perfectly spaced hangers. Pulling it down, she felt its weight and heard the faint rustle of paper. Inside were more envelopes from the same unfamiliar P.O. box she'd seen earlier. At first, she assumed they were duplicates of the mortgage statements, but as she unfolded the top letter, her breath caught. It wasn't about a mortgage at all. The letter was from the bank's loan department, addressed to Daniel, confirming the approval of a substantial home equity loan taken out 3 months ago. Evelyn's eyes darted to the signature line. It bore Daniel's name, but the handwriting was suspiciously smooth, lacking the small quirks she'd known since his childhood. She dug deeper into the bag, pulling out more documents. Correspondence from a real estate agency, a property appraisal, and Evelyn's pulse quickened, a preliminary sales contract for her house. The buyer's name was blank. The date open-ended, but the intent was clear. Clara was preparing to sell the house. The realization hit with the force of a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. The mortgage scam had been theft, yes, but this was erasure. Not just taking money, but taking the very ground she stood on, the walls that had held her family for decades. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed, the documents spread out like a crime scene. Her mind replayed the small moments from the past year. Clara insisting on new decor. Clara pushing Evelyn to spend more time elsewhere. Clara suggesting that the house was too big for just one person. She thought it was about control, about making Evelyn feel like a guest. But now she saw the larger design. Clara was clearing the board entirely, making sure that when Evelyn was gone, nothing of hers remained. She traced the printed words with her fingertips, her thoughts drifting to Daniel. Was he truly ignorant of this? Or had Clara convinced him that selling was the best option? The Daniel she raised would never willingly strip his mother of her home, but the Daniel shaped by 12 years with Clara. She wasn't as certain. For a brief moment, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope as her eyes fell on the deed, still secure in her nightstand upstairs. Legally, she still owned everything. That small victory steadied her hands, but the hope was short-lived. If Clara had already set the wheels in motion with the bank and a real estate agency, there could be forged documents in play, lawyers lined up, even buyers waiting. Evelyn imagined returning from a simple errand one day to find strangers moving furniture out the front door. The image burned into her mind, chilling her more than any winter draft. She gathered the documents back into the leather tote, her movements methodical. She would show everything to Harold. This wasn't just a matter of family conflict, it was potential fraud, maybe even criminal. But there was another, more personal decision forming beneath the surface. She would not wait for Clara to make her next move. The woman had already underestimated her once, assuming Evelyn would quietly scrub floors while the house was being stolen from under her feet. That would not happen again. Evelyn placed the tote beside the folder on her nightstand and sat in her reading chair, letting the quiet settle. The pendulum of her emotions swung violently, the dull ache of betrayal, the brief warmth of realizing her legal position, the gut punch of Clara's ultimate plan. Her gaze drifted to the front window. Beyond it, the neighborhood looked unchanged, the Pattersons' laundry line swaying, a boy riding his bike down the sidewalk. But Evelyn knew, in the private battlefield of her home, nothing was the same. She reached for the phone again, this time not just to call Harold, but to make a list. Locks to be changed, valuables to be secured, allies to contact. Clara might think she held every card, but Evelyn had the deed, the documents, and a lifetime of grit, honed from years of single motherhood. When she finally set the phone down, the quiet no longer felt oppressive. It felt strategic, like the pause between chess moves when you know the next one will turn the board in your favor. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of snow. Evelyn thought of Clara's perfectly staged vacation photos, all sun and sand, oblivious to the storm she was walking back into. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest, sharpest smile. Evelyn woke before dawn, her mind already set on the day ahead. The documents from Clara's tote still sat on her nightstand, their presence both a warning and a source of strength. She dressed in warm layers, tied a scarf around her neck, and stepped into the cold morning air with a determined breath that clouded in the frost. Her first stop was Miller's Hardware, the same shop she'd been visiting for decades. Pete Miller looked up from behind the counter, his lined face breaking into a smile. "Evelyn Henderson," he greeted warmly. "Haven't seen you in ages. What brings you here?" "I need new locks, Pete. Good ones. Deadbolts, pick-resistant, the kind that makes someone think twice before trying." Pete's smile faltered, reading the seriousness in her eyes. "I've got just the thing," he said, disappearing into the back and returning with a sturdy brass set. "5 keys, solid construction. You'll sleep easier." She took them without hesitation. "I'll need them installed today." Pete nodded, making a quick call to his nephew, a locksmith who promised to arrive that afternoon. From the hardware store, Evelyn drove across town to Harold Peterson's office. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, ushered her in with a curious glance. Harold himself stood as she entered, concern etched on his features. "You said it was urgent," he began, gesturing for her to sit. Evelyn laid the deed, the forged mortgage statements, and the loan documents on his desk. "I want to be absolutely certain, Harold. This house, it's still mine?" He adjusted his glasses, scanning the papers. "Yes, legally and unequivocally. No transfer, no sale, no encumbrance that can't be undone. You have full authority to control access, make changes, even evict if necessary." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Good, because I'm changing the locks today. And Harold, Clara's preparing to sell it without telling me or Daniel." Harold's jaw tightened. "Then we'll prepare a formal notice. You have every right to protect your property. Do you want me to initiate fraud proceedings?" "Not yet," Evelyn said firmly. "First, I take back my space." By mid-afternoon, the locksmith had replaced every lock in the house, front, back, side doors, even the garage. Evelyn held the small ring of 5 keys in her palm, the cool metal a tangible sign of control returning to her. One for herself, one for Harold, one for her older son David, one for a trusted neighbor, and one spare tucked away. Daniel would not get his until he came to her, face to face, and they talked on her terms. Next came the purge. Evelyn had already decided everything Clara had brought into this house would go. It wasn't just about taste. It was about cleansing the space of her presence, the subtle erasures she'd committed over the years. She called Martha Branson's consignment shop. By evening, 2 strong boys were hauling out Clara's pristine white leather sofa, the glass dining table no one dared eat on, the minimalist guest bed that had never hosted a real visitor. Evelyn stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching each piece vanish into the truck. She felt lighter with every departure. When the rooms stood empty, she filled them again, not with expensive showpieces, but with furniture she loved. The next day brought deliveries, a soft blue sectional that invited you to curl up with a book, a dining table of reclaimed wood, worn smooth by time, a solid oak bed frame that reminded her of her parents' farmhouse. She placed a comfortable reading chair by the living room window, exactly where the afternoon sun pooled in winter. The last step was the most personal. From the back of her closet, Evelyn retrieved the boxes Clara had exiled to her bedroom years ago. Frames wrapped in paper, dusty albums, small sculptures Daniel had made in school. She unwrapped each one like a treasure, placing them where they belonged. The wedding photo she and her late husband had taken outside this very house went above the mantel. A picture of a 6-year-old Daniel, face smeared with chocolate cake, claimed the spot in the hallway where Clara's abstract print had hung. By the time the sun dipped low, the house looked different. Not perfect, not staged, but lived in. Warm. Hers. Evelyn sank into her new sofa with a cup of tea, looking around at the reclaimed space. The walls seemed to exhale, relieved of the pressure to impress guests. The rooms felt alive with memory again, each one whispering, "You belong here." She thought of Clara's return in a week's time, the confusion and outrage that would bloom when her key no longer turned. Evelyn didn't smile exactly, but there was a calm satisfaction in her chest. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. In the kitchen, The clock ticked softly. Evelyn took another sip of tea and reached for a notepad. There was still much to plan. Legal notices, conversations with Daniel, perhaps even a quiet word to the neighbors. But tonight she allowed herself the luxury of simply being home. No longer an unwanted guest, no longer silent. Just Evelyn, in her house, on her terms. By the second evening, the transformation of the house was nearly complete. Evelyn moved slowly from room to room, running her fingertips along the surfaces she'd chosen, breathing in the faint scent of fresh wood and fabric. The sterile perfection Clara had curated was gone, replaced with a lived-in comfort that seemed to soften the very air. The guest room was the last to tackle. Dust motes swirled lazily in the shaft of late afternoon light, filtering through the curtains as she pulled open the closet. It was mostly empty now. Clara had never allowed real guests to stay here, but in the far corner sat an old cedar chest. Evelyn frowned. She hadn't seen it in years. She dragged it into the center of the room, kneeling to brush away a thin film of dust before unlatching the brass clasp. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint scent of cedar and something else. Old paper, fabric long stored away. Inside were relics of another life. Her late husband's wool sweater, yellowed newspaper clippings from when Daniel had won a science fair, and at the very bottom, a worn leather-bound journal. Her breath caught. She recognized it immediately, her husband's handwriting embossed in every crease of the cover. She carried it to the bed and sat, the weight of it solid in her lap. The first entries were familiar. Grocery lists, notes on the garden, reminders about bills. Then in the middle, she found a section dated more than 30 years ago. The handwriting shifted slightly as if her husband had been trying to capture something precious. Daniel asked me today if mommies can get hurt by bad people. I told him yes, but that's why daddies are here. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "When I'm big, I'll protect mommy forever." He was only 8, but he meant it with all his little boy heart. Evelyn's vision blurred. She traced the ink with her fingertip, feeling the years collapse into a single moment. The smell of cookies cooling on the counter, Daniel's small arms wrapping around her waist, the fierce sincerity in his young eyes. She closed the journal and held it to her chest, letting the wave of memory wash over her. The warmth of that promise filled her, but beneath it was a sharp pang, because somewhere along the way, that vow had been lost. Daniel had let Clara's voice drown out his own. He had watched, silent as his mother became a shadow in her own home. A tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The ache in her chest wasn't just grief for the past, it was grief for the woman she had allowed herself to become. But the memory of that small boy's promise was like a spark in the dark, catching on something deep inside her. Evelyn stood, setting the journal gently on the bed. Her gaze swept the room, the bare walls, the fresh linens, the sunlight spilling across the floor. This house was hers. Her life was hers. And she would not let anyone, not even her own son's neglect, take that away again. She returned to the closet, pulling out a small box of nails and a hammer from the hall. From the journal, she tore a single page, the one with her husband's note about Daniel's promise. She placed it in a simple wooden frame she found in the attic, its glass slightly chipped at the corner. With steady hands, she hung it on the wall opposite the bed, where anyone staying here would see it. It wasn't decoration, it was a reminder. As she stepped back, Evelyn felt something shift. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer pressed her down. Instead, it anchored her resolve. She had been passive for too long, hoping others would see her worth without her having to demand it. Those days were over. The kettle whistled from the kitchen, breaking her thoughts. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, carrying it to the living room where the fire glowed low. She sat in her reading chair, journal on her lap, and began turning pages again, not just reliving memories, but drawing strength from them. The story of her life wasn't over. The best chapters might still be ahead, but only if she wrote them herself. Evelyn glanced toward the front door. In a few days, Clara would return, expecting the same submissive woman she'd left behind. She would find a stranger instead, a woman who had reclaimed her home, her voice, and her place in the family. And Evelyn would be ready, not with bitterness, but with unshakable clarity. She took another sip of tea and allowed herself a small smile. The promise in that journal had been made to her decades ago, but now she intended to keep it herself. She would protect her own life, her own happiness forever. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches. Evelyn leaned back, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. No longer just surviving, she was preparing. And when the moment came, she would stand in her own doorway, look Clara in the eye, and let her see just how much had changed. The morning they returned, the air was still and sharp with winter cold. Evelyn was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, the steady tick of the clock the only sound in the house. She knew the exact moment their SUV pulled into the driveway, the muffled thud of car doors, the quick patter of little feet, Clara's sharp voice cutting through the cold air. Through the frosted window, Evelyn saw them standing on the porch, shuffling bags and jackets. Daniel stepped up first, sliding his key into the lock. A pause. Then the sound of metal scraping uselessly. He tried again, frowning. "That's strange," he muttered. Clara's tone sharpened instantly. "You're using the wrong key." "I'm not." Daniel jiggled the handle again, tried another key, then another. None of them fit. Evelyn stayed seated, watching from her place at the table. She could almost feel the frustration building outside. "Mom," Daniel's voice finally called, muffled through the door. "Mom, the lock isn't working." She set down her coffee, walked to the door, and turned the handle slowly. The cold air swept in as she opened it just enough to see their faces. Daniel's confusion, Clara's growing anger, the children huddled behind them with travel-worn eyes. "Welcome back," Evelyn said evenly. Daniel stepped forward. "Something's wrong with the lock. None of our keys." He stopped mid-sentence, peering past her into the house. "What happened to the living room?" Clara pushed in front of him, her eyes darting around. The new sofa, the reclaimed wood table, the family photographs on the walls. None of it hers. "Where's my dining set?" she demanded. Evelyn's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Gone. Sold. The furniture didn't suit me." Clara's mouth fell open. "You sold my furniture? That was expensive." "It was purchased for my house," Evelyn cut in, her tone sharp enough to make the words land like a blade. "Which means it was mine to sell." Daniel blinked, looking between them. "Your house? Mom, what are you talking about? We've been paying the mortgage for years." Evelyn's eyes locked on Clara's. "There is no mortgage. Hasn't been for 15 years. The deed is in my name. Always has been." Daniel stared, confusion shading into disbelief. "But I've been sending payments to a bank account your wife set up," Evelyn finished for him. "A bank account that doesn't belong to me or to any mortgage company. You've been paying her, Daniel, not the bank, not me." For a moment, silence hung in the doorway like a heavy curtain. Then Daniel turned, his eyes narrowing on Clara. "Is that true?" Clara's expression hardened, but a faint tremor ran through her hands. "Daniel, you don't understand." "Answer me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I was protecting our finances," Clara snapped. "Your mother doesn't need this house. She's old. The words seemed to die in her throat as she realized what she'd said. Daniel's face shifted as though a wall had cracked behind his eyes. Evelyn watched the truth sink in for him, the years of small slights, the manipulations, the wedge driven between mother and son. "This was never your house," Evelyn said softly to Clara, "and I will not be treated like a servant in it." Clara's breath quickened, her cheeks flushed deep crimson, and her voice rose to a near scream. "You think you can just—" She swayed suddenly, eyes rolling back, and collapsed onto the porch floor. "Clara!" Daniel lunged forward, kneeling beside her. The children froze, wide-eyed. Evelyn stepped aside, opening the door fully. "You'd better call an ambulance," she said evenly. Daniel glanced up at her, his face pale. "Mom, this isn't the time," Evelyn said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Get her the help she needs. We'll talk later." The sound of sirens came minutes later, red lights flashing against the frost-white siding of the house. Paramedics lifted Clara onto a stretcher, murmuring about possible stress or exhaustion. She stirred, eyes fluttering open long enough to find Evelyn's gaze. "You did this," she hissed weakly. Evelyn met her stare without flinching. "No, Clara, you did this to yourself." The stretcher rolled away, the children trailing behind Daniel as he followed the paramedics to the ambulance. Evelyn stood in the open doorway, her breath visible in the cold air. She watched them go until the sirens faded into the distance. When she closed the door, the quiet inside was immediate and complete. She walked back to the kitchen, poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. The warmth of the mug seeped into her hands, steadying them. It wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but for the first time in years, the balance had shifted. The truth was out and the house was hers in every way that mattered. She sipped her coffee slowly, already thinking of what needed to come next. As Clara's body slumped to the porch, her phone slid from the pocket of her coat and clattered onto the wooden boards. It landed face up, the screen lighting in the winter dusk. No one noticed at first. Daniel was bent over her, calling her name, and the children stood frozen, unsure what to do. Evelyn stepped forward but stopped herself. Years of being pushed aside had taught her when to stay still and when to act. She let Daniel fuss, checking Clara's pulse, murmuring reassurances. The phone's lock screen was still active. A bright notification banner glowed across it. One new message. "Everything will be ours soon." The sender's name was an unfamiliar string of numbers. Daniel's eyes flicked to it mid-sentence. For a moment, he froze, caught between the weight of what he'd read and the urgency of Clara lying in his arms. Evelyn saw the tension ripple across his face, the tightening of his jaw, the quick, shallow breath. "What is it?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Nothing," he muttered, though his gaze lingered on the phone for a heartbeat too long. He picked it up, almost casually, and slipped it into his pocket before the paramedics arrived. As they moved Clara onto the stretcher, Daniel avoided looking at his mother. Evelyn, in turn, didn't press him. She'd learned that truth had a way of working itself to the surface, given time. When the ambulance pulled away, the children with it, Daniel stayed behind for a moment. The air was heavy, the sky dimming into the deep blues of evening. He stood on the porch, one hand in his coat pocket where the phone now rested. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low, "what you said earlier, about the mortgage, about Clara." "It's all true," Evelyn replied, meeting his eyes. "I have the documents. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I wouldn't have believed you," he finished for her, his tone tinged with guilt. They stood in silence for a beat. The edge of confrontation from earlier had softened, replaced by something quieter, almost fragile. Evelyn could sense him weighing her words against the years of Clara's influence. Then, without warning, Daniel pulled the phone from his pocket and unlocked it. He scrolled quickly, his brow furrowing deeper with each swipe. Finally, he turned the screen toward her. The text was there again in bold letters. "Everything will be ours soon." Beneath it were older messages from the same number. Talk of closing dates, moving funds, and finalizing the plan. Evelyn felt a chill crawl through her, sharper than the cold air. "That's not from you?" she asked. "Of course not." His voice was clipped, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "And she never mentioned anything like this to me." They both knew what it meant, though neither said it outright. Clara wasn't acting alone. Someone else was involved in the scheme to take the house, and maybe more. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't even recognize this number." Evelyn studied him, searching for signs of doubt or denial, but what she saw instead was something unfamiliar. Suspicion. Not toward her, but toward Clara. It was a crack in the wall that had stood between them for years. "I'll keep the phone," Daniel said, slipping it back into his pocket. "For now, don't say anything to anyone, not until I figure out who's behind this." "You don't have much time," Evelyn warned, "once she realizes you've seen those messages." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm, "but I'm not going to let her blindside me again." The determination in his tone stirred something in Evelyn, a faint echo of the boy who once promised to protect her. She nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them, though the tension remained. Daniel's gaze swept the changed living room again, the furniture, the photographs, and for the first time, he didn't look disapproving. "You've been busy," he said, almost an understatement. "I was taking back what's mine," she replied simply. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he just nodded. "I'll be in touch once I know more. Don't open the door to anyone you don't trust." Evelyn watched him go, his figure retreating down the walkway. The sound of his car engine faded into the distance, leaving the house in silence once more. She stood in the doorway, feeling the shift in the air, not just the cold outside, but something in the balance between them. Back in the kitchen, she poured herself another cup of coffee, her mind turning over the new piece of the puzzle. Clara's betrayal had been bad enough, but this message hinted at a larger game. Whoever was on the other end of that number wasn't going to stop just because Clara was in a hospital bed. Evelyn took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. The storm was still coming, but now she wasn't standing alone. 3 days passed before Evelyn saw Daniel again. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the yard in a quiet, pristine white. She was in the living room mending a loose button on her cardigan when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. She opened the door before he could knock. Daniel stood there, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his heavy coat, his eyes shadowed by lack of sleep. He looked older than she remembered, older than just a few days should have made him. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Evelyn stepped aside, letting him enter. The warmth of the house seemed to wrap around him, but he didn't relax. He lingered in the hallway for a moment, glancing at the familiar photos on the wall, the ones Clara had once packed away. They sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Evelyn had told him the truth about the mortgage. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the kettle on the stove. "I've been to see Clara," Daniel began finally. "Twice. She's not doing well. At least that's what she says." Evelyn waited, her expression neutral. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I think you've been right about her for a long time. I just didn't want to see it. It was easier to believe she was difficult rather than dishonest." Evelyn said nothing, letting the words settle between them. "She's been in my ear for years," he continued, "telling me you were too controlling, that you didn't respect our marriage, that you were trying to hold on to this house just to spite us. And I believed her because I didn't want to admit I was letting her make all the decisions. About the kids, about the money, about everything." The kettle whistled softly. Evelyn rose to pour them both tea, setting a steaming mug in front of him. He stared into it as if the swirling steam might offer him answers. "She kept saying this house was too much for you, that selling it would set us all up for a better future. I thought—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I thought she was looking out for everyone, but now I know she was looking out for herself." Evelyn's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "And the message on her phone?" Daniel met her eyes, guilt flickering there. "I've been trying to trace the number. It's not anyone I know, but the more I think about it, the more I realize she's been hiding things from me for a long time, and I can't live like that anymore." He took a long breath, as if gathering himself for the hardest part. "I'm going to file for divorce, Mom. I've spoken to a lawyer already. I'm not telling her yet. I want to make sure the kids are settled first, but it's happening." For a moment, Evelyn saw not the man in front of her, but the little boy from her husband's journal, vowing to protect her. There was something of that boy in his eyes now, something true. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking just slightly, "for not believing you, for not defending you when I should have. I don't know if I can make up for that, but I want to try." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "I can forgive you, Daniel, but forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I need boundaries. I need to know I can live in my own home without feeling like I'm an intruder." He nodded immediately. "You have my word. The kids and I, when they visit, it'll be on your terms. And if you ever feel like I'm crossing a line, you tell me and I'll listen. No more letting someone else speak for me." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands still joined. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. Evelyn thought about the years lost to misunderstanding, the distance Clara had cultivated between them. It hurt to know those years could never be reclaimed, but there was also a quiet relief in knowing they didn't have to keep living that way. Daniel sipped his tea, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since he'd arrived. "The kids miss you," he said. "Sophie's been asking if she can come over next weekend." Evelyn felt her lips curve into a small smile. "Of course. This is still their home, too." They talked a little longer, about the children's school projects, about the snowstorm expected later in the week, but there was an unspoken understanding that the real conversation had already happened. The rest was just breathing space, a way to let the new shape of their relationship settle. When Daniel stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Thank you, Mom, for giving me another chance." Evelyn watched him step out into the snow, his figure disappearing into the white. She closed the door gently, the quiet of the house no longer feeling like absence, but possibility. Daniel had already opened the door to leave when he stopped, his hand lingering on the knob. The snow outside was falling heavier now, flakes catching in the dim porch light. He turned back to her, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice lower than before. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but you deserve to hear it from me." Evelyn's chest tightened. "Go on." Daniel stepped away from the door, setting his gloves on the table. "Clara's not just angry about the house or the divorce. She's planning to fight for full custody of the kids, and she's threatening to claim you've hurt them, that you've abused them." For a moment, Evelyn didn't move. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Her mind reeled, not because she feared anyone would believe such a lie, but because of what it would mean for Sophie and Ben. Even the accusation alone could plant seeds of doubt, could hurt them in ways that would last far beyond any legal battle. Her hands curled around the back of a chair, steadying herself. "She said this to you?" Daniel nodded grimly. "Not directly. She told her lawyer, and her lawyer passed it to mine. I think she hoped I'd back off the divorce if I thought she'd drag you through the mud." He hesitated. "She doesn't have anything real. There's nothing to have, but she's willing to lie if it gets her what she wants." The warmth from their earlier conversation cooled, replaced by a deep, pulsing unease. Evelyn pictured Sophie's bright eyes, Ben's crooked smile, and the thought of them being told, even for a moment, that their grandmother had harmed them made her stomach knot. "She's playing with fire," Evelyn said quietly, "and she doesn't care who gets burned." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I won't let her do this to you, to them. I've already told my lawyer we'll fight it, and I'll testify to every moment I've seen you with the kids. I wanted you to be prepared." Evelyn took a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs before she spoke. "Daniel, I appreciate that, but I need you to understand. If it comes down to protecting them or protecting myself, I'll choose them every time. I won't drag them through some ugly courtroom scene just to clear my name." He looked at her sharply. "So what, you'd just let her get away with it?" "I said I'd protect them," she replied evenly. "That doesn't mean surrendering. It means being smart. It means making sure they never have to hear those words in the first place. If that requires me to make sacrifices, I will. But I won't be intimidated in my own home, and I won't let her think she's broken me." There was steel in her voice now, a quiet defiance that made Daniel sit back slightly. For years, she'd been the one to avoid confrontation, to let slights pass without answer. Now, her calm was something different, not resignation, but resolve. "You really think you can handle her?" he asked, almost incredulous. Evelyn allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "I've handled worse than her. I've handled life without a husband, 2 jobs at once, bills that didn't match my paycheck, and raising you while keeping this house from falling apart. Clara is just another challenge, and like all the others, she'll pass." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll do it your way. But I'm not stepping back, Mom. Not this time." The tension in her chest eased slightly. "Good, because they're going to need both of us." For a few moments, they simply sat together, the snow pattering softly against the window. Despite the shadow Clara had cast over their lives, there was a rare stillness in the kitchen, a sense of alliance that had been missing for too many years. Finally, Daniel rose again, pulling on his gloves. "I'll keep you updated, and if she tries anything before the papers are filed, you call me, day or night." Evelyn walked him to the door. "Drive safe," she said, and for the first time in years, it wasn't just a habit. It was layered with the weight of everything they'd promised each other tonight. He nodded, stepping out into the swirling snow. She watched his taillights disappear into the white before closing the door and leaning against it for a moment. The threat Clara had made was a dangerous one, and it could not be ignored. But Evelyn felt the steady beat of her own heart, strong and certain. She was no longer standing alone, and that made all the difference. She turned off the lights and moved through the quiet house, her fingers brushing over the framed photos on the wall. Sophie's laughter, Ben's tiny hands in hers, those were the truths she held on to. No lie Clara could spin would ever erase them. 6 months later, spring had settled gently over the neighborhood. The snow was long gone, replaced by the hum of bees in the garden and the steady rustle of new leaves. Evelyn stood on her porch, the afternoon sun warming her shoulders, watching Sophie and Ben chase each other across the yard. Their laughter floated up to her like music. It had been a long road since that cold day when Daniel stood in her kitchen, confessing the truth about Clara. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago. Clara had fought hard at first, but when Daniel's lawyer presented evidence of the forged mortgage documents and the suspicious text messages, her case collapsed. The custody battle never reached court. Clara had agreed to joint custody, but the children spent every other weekend without fail at Evelyn's. Daniel had changed too. There was less tension in his shoulders now, less distance in his eyes when he looked at her. He came by often, not just to drop off the kids, but to stay for dinner, to help fix a squeaky hinge, to ask her advice about things he once would have hidden. Evelyn's house, once stripped of warmth, now bloomed again. The living room was filled with books and soft blankets. The kitchen smelled of bread or cinnamon most weekends, and the photos on the walls told a story of family reclaimed. She stepped off the porch, walking toward the garden where Sophie knelt beside the raised beds, poking at the soil with a stick. "Grandma," Sophie said, looking up with bright eyes, "the strawberries are starting to grow." Evelyn crouched beside her. "They'll be ready by the time summer comes. We'll make jam together, just like I used to with your dad when he was your age." Ben ran up, his cheeks flushed. "Can I help too?" "Of course," Evelyn said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But you'll have to promise not to eat all the strawberries before they get to the kitchen." He grinned, the same crooked smile that had always melted her heart. Later, after the children had gone inside to wash up, Daniel joined her on the porch with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one and sat beside her, their silence companionable. "You've done a lot with the place," he said, glancing at the flower boxes along the railing, the curtains fluttering in the open windows. "It feels like home again." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It always was. I just had to remind it, and myself, of that." Daniel took a sip of tea, then set the mug down. I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done for the kids. They're lighter now, happier. I think they feel safe here, in a way they didn't before. That's because they know they're loved, Evelyn said simply. No matter what happens between the adults, they know this is their place. They sat for a while, watching the children through the window as they helped set the table for dinner. The evening light cast everything in a soft gold, the kind of light that made even old scars seem less sharp. Evelyn thought back to the woman she'd been before all of this, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who let others decide her place in her own home. That woman was gone. She had fought for her dignity, her home, and her family, and she had won, not in a courtroom battle alone, but in the everyday moments that built trust again. Daniel turned to her, his voice quiet. You know, I've been thinking about that promise I made when I was little, the one Dad wrote about in his journal. Evelyn's heart tightened, but she kept her gaze steady. I didn't keep it for a long time, he admitted, but I want you to know. I will now. You've done enough protecting for both of us. It's my turn to be there for you. Evelyn reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You already are, Daniel. They were called inside by Sophie's voice announcing that dinner was ready. The table was laid with roasted chicken, fresh bread, and a salad from Evelyn's garden. The children chattered through the meal, telling stories about school and friends, while Daniel and Evelyn listened, occasionally exchanging a glance that held both gratitude and the unspoken recognition of how far they'd come. After the dishes were cleared, they all gathered in the living room. Sophie curled up beside Evelyn on the couch, Ben sprawled on the rug with his toy cars, and Daniel sat in the armchair, a quiet smile on his face. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, though the air was already warm with spring. Evelyn looked around the room at the faces she loved most and felt the steady flame of something she thought she'd lost, the certainty that she belonged, not because someone allowed her to, but because she had claimed it. She was the keeper of this home, the anchor of this family, and as long as she drew breath, she would guard that flame. The weeks after Daniel's divorce papers were finalized passed in a calm rhythm Evelyn hadn't known in years. Her days were filled with tending the garden, baking for the weekends when Sophie and Ben stayed over, and quiet evenings reading by the fire. One sunny afternoon, she decided to walk to the local market instead of driving. The air was warm, scented faintly with lilacs blooming along the sidewalks, and the simple act of strolling through her neighborhood felt like a small luxury. She filled her basket with fresh greens, strawberries, and a loaf of crusty bread still warm from the bakery. She was halfway through the dairy aisle when she heard it. Her name spoken softly, almost tentatively. Evelyn? She turned, and for a moment her mind struggled to reconcile the woman standing before her with the image burned into her memory. Clara's once perfectly coiffed hair was now pulled into a loose, uneven bun. The tailored dresses had been replaced by a plain store uniform, its logo embroidered above the breast pocket. She looked thinner, paler, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. Hi, Clara said, forcing a small smile. It's been a while. Evelyn's first instinct was surprise, followed quickly by a tightening in her chest. She thought of the last time they'd seen each other. Clara on the porch, red-faced with rage before collapsing, her schemes unraveling in front of everyone. Clara glanced around as if hoping no one else was watching. I'm just working here now. Things have been different. Her voice wavered slightly, though she tried to keep her tone casual. How are the kids? Evelyn studied her for a moment, the silence stretching between them. She could have asked a dozen questions about the mysterious number, about her fall from grace, but she realized with a calm certainty that she didn't need any answers. Clara's life now told its own story. They're well, Evelyn said simply, her voice warm but firm. Clara's eyes flickered, as though searching for an opening. I know things ended badly. I wish... She trailed off, glancing down at the floor. Maybe someday we could... Evelyn's lips curved into a small, polite smile. Not cold, not cruel, just final. Take care of yourself, Clara. And with that, she adjusted the strap of her basket and stepped past her, the soft tap of her shoes on the tile the only sound. As she moved down the aisle, she felt the old weight in her chest dissolve, replaced by something lighter. Pride. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't indulged in anger or gloating. She had simply chosen her own peace over reopening wounds that had already healed. Outside, the sun was warm on her face as she left the store. She walked home slowly, savoring the breeze, the chatter of birds in the trees. Her groceries felt light in her hand, but lighter still was the knowledge that she no longer carried Clara with her, not in her home, not in her mind. Back at the house, Sophie and Ben were in the backyard playing an elaborate game that involved a blanket fort and a plastic dragon. Daniel was on the porch, fixing the hinge on the screen door. He looked up as she came through the gate, smiling in that quiet, grateful way he had these days. "How was the market?" he asked. Evelyn set her basket down and met his gaze. "Peaceful," she said, and meant it. She unpacked the groceries while the children chattered around her, their voices bright against the soft hum of the house. She made sandwiches from the fresh bread, sliced strawberries into a bowl, and poured lemonade into tall glasses. Later, as they all sat together at the porch table, Evelyn glanced out over her garden. The late afternoon light turned the flowers gold, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. She thought briefly of Clara, of the look in her eyes in the dairy aisle, and felt nothing but a distant compassion. Whatever path Clara was on now, it was no longer tangled with hers. The past had tried to take her home, her dignity, and her family, but Evelyn had reclaimed them all. And now, with the people she loved most gathered around her, she knew that was the truest victory.